Hello, and here is the second. We are recording, right? Just let me check here. We are. Okay. Here's the second video. This is cell structure and function. So like I said, we're going to be starting off small and getting larger. For today, I just want to focus on cells. So let's just jump right into it. There we go. So cell theory. The theory about cells is all living things are made of cells. Cells are the smallest working units of all living things. As we said in the last video, it's the smallest unit that can carry out life processes, those 7 characteristics of life. All cells come from pre-existing cells through cell division. So cells don't just magically appear, they have to come from other cells. So those 3 things make up the basics of cell theory. The definition of a cell, it's the smallest unit that is capable of performing life functions. Or in other words, it's the smallest living thing. You can't get any smaller and still call it living. Examples, we have an amoeba, we have plants, a plant cell, plant stem here, bacteria, nerve cell, and a red blood cell. So there are 2 types of cells. There are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. There are prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells. And we're going to break those down right now. Prokaryotes do not have structures surrounded by membranes. Remember I said organelles, those little like mini organs inside a cell? There aren't any here. There's just stuff free floating inside this thing. So as you can see, it says DNA right here. The DNA is just floating around in the middle of this prokaryote. They have very few internal structures, just a couple little ribosomes and some DNA, and all floating around in the cytoplasm. That's it. Most one-celled organisms are bacteria. So this right here, probably bacteria. Now we have eukaryotes. These are much larger. They contain organelles that are each one is surrounded by its own membrane. Most living things are eukaryotic. Here are some examples of eukaryotes. You can see how much more complex they are. There's just so much more stuff going on in here. And sure, there are a couple more free-floating things going on, but they're all surrounded by their own membrane, which is a large difference between them and the prokaryotes from the last slide here, is that they're all protected by their own little membranes. So here's a plant cell. You can tell it's a plant cell because of these hard, rigid walls, which we'll talk about later. And here is an animal cell, much more, much less structured, I should say. That's usually drawn and depicted as more blob-like, not quite as rigid. So a typical animal cell, here's a picture of it. This is actually from a coloring sheet that I like to have my students do. And here's a plant cell. Again, you really get to see the difference between the hard rigidity, how this looks like a brick almost. And that's what gives plants the ability to stand on their own. It's what gives them that rigidity, especially right here, this big white blob in here, the vacuole. That's basically where their water is stored. So when a plant doesn't get water, it wilts. That's when this thing is empty. It doesn't have water in it. So it loses that rigidity and it starts to wilt and fall over. So okay, here's the animal cell, plant cell. You can see one is much more rigid than the other. One looks very squishy. So cell parts, let's get into the organelles and see what each one does here. Surrounding the cell, we have what's called the cell membrane. The outer membrane of the cell controls what comes in and out of the cell, and it's usually a double layer with heads, with each layer, like it looks kind of like a tooth or like a jellyfish with a head and some tails coming down, and then you can see the heads down here with tails coming into the middle. So that's how it works. That's what it looks like here. So it's a double layer. And then plants have a cell wall, which is, like this says, it's commonly found in plants and bacteria, and it supports and protects the cells. Inside the cell now, probably what I consider to be the most important is the nucleus. It directs the cell activities, and it's separated from the cytoplasm by the nuclear membrane, and it contains your DNA. That's why I feel like it's just, a vital component to your cells. The nuclear membrane. It surrounds the nucleus, made up of 2 layers just like the cell membrane, and it has openings to allow material to enter and leave. Mostly ribosomes, because they make the proteins for the DNA. Now, there are chromosomes in the nucleus. The chromosomes are made up of DNA. They contain instructions for the traits and your characteristics. So these are the parts of the DNA that make you, you. And then there's the nucleolus, which is inside the nucleus. And this has RNA, which helps make proteins. Sorry if I'm going a little fast, but fortunately you can just pause this at any time if I am. So cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is a gel-like mixture, and it's surrounded by the membrane. So basically, let me just jump way back here to the picture of the cell. The cytoplasm is all of this yellow, okay? So it's what all these organelles kind of float around in. That's what the cytoplasm is. So in a plant cell, it'd be like this light blue all in here. That's the cytoplasm. Okay, let's get back here. There we go. So it contains hereditary material, but again, not quite as much as the nucleus, or the chromosomes, I should say. Now there's the endoplasmic reticulum, and there are 2 types of endoplasmic reticulum, but they both move materials around in the cell, and but the smooth type does not have ribosomes. The rough type, which is in this picture here, does. There are ribosomes embedded into its surface. Ribosomes make proteins, which we'll get into later, but it gives it this rough appearance, and that's where the 2 different names come from: smooth type, rough type. Okay, ribosomes. Each cell has thousands of these things. They make proteins, and they are found on the endoplasmic reticulum, not the ribosomes. I have a typo there. They're found on the endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum, and floating throughout the cell. The mitochondria, the mighty mitochondria, as I call it, it produces the energy through chemical reactions, breaking down fats and carbohydrates. So this is what provides energy for the cell. It controls the level of water and other materials in the cell as well. And it recycles and decomposes proteins, fats, and carbs. So this thing is like a huge center of activity for the cell. Lots of energy coming out of this thing. Now there are the Golgi bodies. They are the protein packaging plants, I like to call them. So they'll take a ribosome, package it up, send it down the endoplasmic reticulum, and it'll go to wherever it needs to go. So they move materials within a cell, just like the endoplasmic reticulum, but they can also move materials out of the cell, which is fun. Now, lysosome, I remember lysosome because it looks like Lysol is right in the middle of it. And Lysol cleans things. So what do these guys do? They clean up the cell. They digest. They digest plant. They're the digestive plant. Sorry, they're the digestive plant for proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. So they are kind of like the stomach. They take out everything, all the excess stuff, and they break it down. They transport the undigested material out of the cell, to the membrane for removal. And if the cell will break down if the lysosome explodes. So these are a pretty key feature here. Without them, the cell gets filled up with garbage and has a hard time processing. Vacuoles, these are membrane-bound sacs for storage, digestion, and waste removal. They contain a water solution, which I talked about earlier when the plants wilt. So these are found only in plants. You won't really find these in many animal cells. And like I said, they help maintain plant shape with the amount of water content that's in them. Now there are the chloroplasts. These are easy for a lot of people to remember. They're found in plant cells, a couple animal cells, like some bacteria, things like that. But they contain green chlorophyll. They are why plants are green. And this is where photosynthesis takes place because of the chlorophyll. Photosynthesis happens in the chloroplasts here. Excuse me. So how cells move. This is our last slide, our last point of discussion here. So there are 3 different ways cells can move. Some have flagella that aid in movement. So this long tail right here is a flagella, and they whip it back and forth, and it propels them through whatever it is that they are in. Next is cilia, which are thousands and thousands of little hairs that would cover the exterior of an organism, and they use these to just kind of glide across to wherever they need to go. And lastly, these are mostly what you would see in an amoeba, or if you ever saw like the old horror movie The Blob. This is an example of how the blob would move, where basically they stretch themselves out. So it would be a big ball, and then a big glob of it would come out, and then the rest would just follow. It would pull itself along, basically. So it would stretch an arm out, and then the rest would follow suit. So those are the basics of cells. There's a lot more to get into with them, but for a modified biology course, as long as we have the basics down and you can identify them, then that's really the important thing. So I hope you learned a lot. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in our last video.